Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. It's July 13th, 2020. This is one of my favorite topics. I know that I say that quite a bit, but I really do love this topic because it's something as a therapist and a father that I've learned maybe the most about over the years. I want to clarify something without making it too complicated and talk about our program for just a moment. In our program, there are a few letters that are standard that come out of the field, that come from children to the parents. And then there are a couple of letters that are standard that come from the parent to the child. And they have different names. One of the letters that is shared, closely shared, is something that is referred to by its acronym, the LOA. The letter that comes to the parent is referred to as the letter of awareness. The letter that comes from the parent is called the letter of accountability. Historically, in our program, they were both called the letter of accountability, but there was something that we felt like with our students, with our clients, that word accountability had such a kind of a policing feel to it, like a I gotcha kind of feel to it, that there was a hierarchy there that put the child on the defensive. So we changed it to awareness, which is essentially none of the instructions about that letter changed, but we wanted a different feeling about that letter. As a child has been sent in many cases to treatment without their consideration, without their being asked. We wanted to have a letter that was more inviting and that would less likely put them on the defensive. So we switched it to the letter of awareness for the child, and it remains the letter of accountability for the parent. And the second point about that is that I want to be as clear as I can about this next idea, and that is you occupy a different position in your child's mind and psyche than they occupy in yours. And that cannot be overstated. You occupy a different part, a different size in their psyche or their mind than they occupy in yours. You are so much to them. You become, from the earliest pre-verbal, non-verbal age, you become a mirror for them. While that can happen to us as parents sometimes, it's not the same value. You don't hold the same value. How you see, feel, and think about your child weighs enormously on their shoulders for positive and for negative, and weighs much less on our shoulders as parents, the way our children think and feel about us. Although for some of us, I can say that can sometimes take too much of a balance. But there's a different position, a different role that you occupy with your child than they occupy with you. So that's one way, one reason why we've changed the title of these assignments. There's another assignment that has its complement in our program. The letter that you write to your child is called the hopes and intentions letter. The letter that they write to you that complements that is called the impact letter. Several years ago, and some of you might know this history, we called both of them the impact letter. But what we saw was that the parent was writing the impact letter in such a way to make the child responsible for the parent's feelings. And we wanted to shift that. We had talked about it, we had taught around it, and just like with the letter of accountability changing to the letter of awareness, we wanted to change the tone and flavor of the letter. So the letter that you write to your child is the hopes and intentions letter, and the letter that they write to you is the impact letter. Now, you might think that's not fair. You might think that that's a shift and that the child is not being made to be accountable, but it's the very structure of the intervention that increases the accountability. They are literally living in an environment with accountability partners 24/7 for several weeks on end. And because I always used to kind of joke lightly that what would it be like if children could send their parents to a program? How many of us would end up in a program? When the fact of the matter is, with adolescents, you can send your child to a program like ours without their permission. And even as they are moving to young adulthood, you still have a lot of leverage over them. So with that difference in power in place, we feel like there's a validity, and I'll talk more about that as we go, between the kinds of letters that you write and the kinds of letters that you receive. So I'll talk about that, but I wanted to give you some history and some context and to talk about how they are different. First of all, let's talk a little bit about the letter that your child writes. your child is the identified patient. They're the one who has earned the title, if you will, or their place in a program like ours. They are the identified patient. They're the one who is symptomatic. And they might argue that you're as symptomatic as they are, but they're symptomatic. They have a diagnosis, that the treatment plan is made for them. They're held at a level of accountability, like I described before, that is really at the highest level. So with that, we changed it to awareness. When they write a letter to you, they're writing a letter that is describing why they're doing what they're doing. And why can feel like, to some people, like they're justifying themselves, right? This is an excuse for my behavior, or this really gives my behavior, gives me permission for my behavior. And really, we're asking them to make connections between what are the feelings, what are the symptoms, and how do those things connect. The acting out behavior, what is underneath it? What unmet needs are at its origin? So we're asking them to really increase in awareness. I'm using drugs, I'm cutting on myself, I'm avoiding school, I'm yelling at my parents, I'm lying to my parents, whatever the acting out behavior is, I'm doing these things, and this is where it comes from. Sometimes when parents get that letter, it can feel to them like the child is making excuses. They can be triggered by that. But I want to make this as clear as I can. The implied accountability, the boundary, specifically right now around your child being in our program, sets the context. It sets the frame. You're not arguing to make a point anymore. And I'll talk about this throughout the broadcast tonight. You're not taking a position of that you're right and they're wrong. You're taking a position, ideally, with the notion of, this is my boundary. This is what we're doing for you. This is what I'm okay with and what I'm not okay with. So the accountability is the larger frame, the larger context. And the awareness letter that they write is talking about the underlying unmet needs, the underlying emotions, of which the symptoms are merely an expression. We're asking them to give voice to their symptomology. I ask this all the time with staff. In fact, this was during a supervision call that I was having today. What's the difference between an explanation of behavior and justification? And most people kind of fumble to kind of figure that out, but let me explain it to you. It's a simple, clear definition. Justification is a defense. Justification is a defense, and a defense is something that we do to protect ourselves from real or perceived threats. So if somebody's justifying themselves, it's because they feel some metaphorical weapon being pointed at them. Blame, shame, anger, disappointment, failure. Something like that is they're trying to ward off with the explanation. Now, an explanation does not necessarily have that quality to it. An explanation is just information. I'm explaining to you why I hit my younger brother today. I'm explaining to you why I lied about smoking. One of the ways you can tell the difference between an explanation and a justification is if you are interrupted, or there's not a place to give that explanation. If it's just an explanation, it's effortless. You're fine with it. If you feel compelled to explain yourself, to prove to the other person that you're worthy, that you're not bad, it's a justification. And what that really signals to the parties involved is that the person is feeling threatened. The person justifying is feeling not okay about themselves in this context, in this interaction. So behaviorally, if we looked at a transcript, in some cases, sometimes it's rather obvious, and the language is dripping with differences. But in a lot of cases, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference between an explanation and a justification on paper, at least in a small context. Justification is a defense, and a defense is in place to protect somebody from a perceived threat. An explanation is just information. We're asking them, like I said, to make connections. So they're going to talk about why I did this. And because we're trying to move the frame away from right and wrong, right? That's not a therapeutic idea. Cutting on yourself, or skipping school, lying to people, ingesting drugs, sexually acting out, whatever the behavior is. As a therapist, you're looking through the lens of psychotherapy and psychology, and you're understanding things as symptoms and the same way that a doctor looks at a broken knee, not as a bad knee or a good knee, but as a broken knee, a torn tendon, not a bad tendon, but a torn tendon. And a psychotherapist looks through that same kind of lens with mental health, the same way that a medical doctor would look at physical health through a lens that has a non-judgmental flavor to it. So we're asking them to make connections. And what comes up for you when they're making connections? Do you feel blamed? Does it feel like they're justifying? And if it does, that could be a signal to you that there's something in the dynamic that needs healing, that needs to be brought to the surface. We explain to them that part of this is confession, similar to a fourth and a fifth step in the 12 steps. Those talk about a fearless moral inventory where you share with at least one other person. There's part of it that's confession, bringing it to light. So there may be new information. Some of it may not be new at all. Some of it might be things that you suspected. But you start to get a flavor or a sense about whether or not they're letting go and whether or not they're trying to sell you on something. I always ask myself, am I being asked to buy something, an idea, a feeling, a perspective on a child? Or does it feel like letting go and surrender? Does it feel to me like they're laying down their armor? And again, the tricky thing about laying down armor is that there are two parts to that equation. One is the courage that it takes to lay it down. But the second part of that equation, and we'll talk about this when we talk about the parent's letter of accountability, is that are we contributing to the relationship in such a way to make it not safe? Even as therapists, we spend so much time as adults and even therapists wondering if we trust the kids. Where's our trust with the child, with the identified patient? And I don't think we spend as much time asking ourselves, what have I done to earn their trust? Do they trust me? And where's my contribution to that part of the equation? So they're not selling anything. I'm not being asked to buy that they're good or innocent or not evil intention or whatever it is. You can feel that. None of these things necessarily speak to a direct behavioral intervention, but they start to ideally bring up for the parent and the therapist some curiosity. What's going on? What might the child be feeling? Over apologizing, I really discourage a lot of apologizing in the letter of awareness. There can be some, of course, but too much of an apology, again, feels more like selling. We're not asking, and an apology, and I'll talk more about this because I'm going to borrow some of tonight's broadcast from Harriet Lerner's book, Why Won't You Apologize? If an apology is aimed at trying to get you to forgive me, that's a little bit different than apologizing because I want to express some empathy and compassion for the ways that I've affected you, the ways that I've hurt you. It's just a little bit different. Getting your forgiveness is getting something from the hurt party. Versus apologizing because I want to be sensitive to the fact that I recognize that I've hurt you. And then promising. There's virtually no place in a letter of awareness for a child in our program In these letters, we're not asking for a promise that you won't do it again, that you'll be better. And when that shows up, again, you can see there's probably some history, some context where there was a power struggle, a power dynamic, where they're still thinking about it as trying to prove something to you. Now, the letter that you write, that we invite you to write, that you sometimes can send to your child, or sometimes you just share it with your therapist or with your sponsor back home, or maybe with your Evoke therapist. We call that the letter of accountability, also called the LOA. When we put this idea out there, and this has happened for decades, when we put the idea out there for the letter of accountability, parents can become hesitant to write this letter. And the most common concern that they have when they express their hesitancy to write the letter of accountability to their child is, I think my child will use this against me. I'm going to explain tonight that a letter of accountability written from what I'll call pure intent cannot be used against you. Similar to an amends letter. An amends letter is in itself a gift, doesn't ask for forgiveness in return, doesn't ask to be condoned. The author doesn't ask to be forgiven or forgotten. It's just the generosity, the gift of the amends or the accountability. Like I said earlier, you occupy a different space in your child's mind. You have inherently more power than they do in the relationship. And therefore, this invitation to surrender control, to surrender psychological hierarchy, is a big ask. And if you have that hesitancy, that resistance to writing something like this because you're afraid your child is going to use it against you, what I would get curious about is if you've been operating, like most families, from a paradigm about who's right and who's wrong. Something called, by systems theorists, that's called a zero-sum game. A zero-sum game is a game where there's a winner and a loser. There's a +1 and a -1. In other words, it always adds up to zero. Zero-sum game. In true accountability, it's not a zero-sum game. I can be 100% responsible. I can be 100% responsible for my 1% of the problem. In fact, I'm not going to make that distinction, but I can be 100% accountable, responsible. I can own 100% of my contribution to the dynamic. And all of you know what that feels and sounds like because you've been in dyads before where somebody apologizes and the first thing that you want to do when that apology feels sincere and generous and warm, the first thing that you want to do is apologize for your part. Everybody listening to this has had that experience on multiple occasions. So you know what it feels like when somebody feels safe. I've shared this story before, but I'm going to share it again in the context of this particular story. It's a generic example that's been recreated more than once. I was working with a family where a child was blaming mom and dad for his lying. Saying something like, you always judged my friends. So I learned at a very young age to hide the details of my friends. You judged the way that they looked, the length of their hair, what they wore, what church they belonged to. There were various things that he was accusing his parents of. And he was justifying his lying based on that behavior that the parents had exhibited. And after listening to this was not, this is important, this was not a child who was often overtly attacking or combative or argumentative. He was more of a passive personality, more internalizing. It was starting to externalize, but that was his flavor. So in this moment where he was angry and he was telling his parents about how it was their fault that he was lying, the mother in this session said to her son, she said, "You're right. I did do that. It wasn't a technique. I had not coached her ahead of time. She was simply able to own it. And it might have been because of the work that we had done leading up to this point, but she owned it. She said, you're absolutely right." And it was near the end of the session. The young man left the session. I was left just with the parents. And the mother asked me the question that probably is on your mind if you're thinking about the scenario. And it was definitely on my mind. She said, "But Brad, how do we teach our son to be accountable for his choices and not to make other people to blame, not to make excuses for his acts? How do we do that? How do we teach him that?" And I said, "You just did. You modeled it. You showed him how to be accountable." And I want to be as, they held some tough boundaries that week and in the coming months. Some really, really tough, courageous, clear, and difficult boundaries for them. But they were able to own their piece of it without that compromising their boundaries. And that's another sign that you've been operating in a context that, where there's a lot of power and hierarchy. When empathizing and owning your part compromises your boundaries, if they somewhat equate to each other, in other words, if I've contributed to your problems, how can I hold you accountable for your behavior? If that sense or that thought comes into your mind, you've been operating in a context where it's about power and control. Who's right and who's wrong? Contrast that with if we've been operating in a paradigm where, yes, I recognize my part, my flaws, my contributions to the dance, and it's not okay with some of your choices. I'm not okay with some of your choices and the way that you're treating me. Those two seemingly exclusive ideas can be present at the same time. If you're operating in the latter way, then you know you're not operating in a system that's defined by hierarchy and right and wrong. So you learn to own your stuff without owning theirs. And most, I don't, maybe it's virtually all, but the vast majority of folks, of parents, this goes for me and for you, for all of us, who operate in a hierarchical model and kind of a patriarchal model. Doesn't have to be a patriarchy, but it often is. That if we're operating in that model, it's because we grew up in that model. We grew up in a family where feelings weren't enough for boundaries, where you had to be right. Both of you had to be right. Parents and child, both had to be right. So we learn in this model to own our stuff without owning theirs. That the two aren't exclusive of each other. It is partially for you about understanding them. Yes, I realize the way I parented you had an impact on you. I know I dented you. And the more work you do, and you know this, those of you who are further along, the more work you do, the more you can recognize your denting of your children. But that awareness, that understanding doesn't preclude healthy, clear boundaries. So you have empathy, you have boundaries simultaneously. That's the most difficult part of a relationship, isn't it? To understand and be sensitive and compassionate, non-judgmental, but still have clear boundaries. My daughter was explaining to me recently, we were talking about apologies, and I might have been discussing something similar to the kinds of principles involved in the parents' letter of accountability. And my daughter, who's getting a PhD in psychology, and some of you know her if you come to our intensives, she said, Dad, we have no example that we know of a divine apology, of God making a mistake and saying, they were sorry. And my daughter was explaining, we believe as psychotherapists doing relational work that apologies are one of the most important things that a person can do for another person. One of the most generous, loving, courageous, heroic, pick your wonderful adjectives. One of the most important things that we can do in our relationships, and we have no examples of divine apologies. Because our deities don't make mistakes and never have anything to apologize for. Just an interesting thought. I'm going to share a few examples. This first one is from my book, The Journey of the Heroic Parent, where I actually cite the Anatomy of Peace book. One of the most important contributions we can make to our child's self-esteem is the ability to forgive ourselves. When you do, you can courageously hold your child accountable for their actions. This is not an abdication of your responsibility as a parent, but rather a refocusing. In the book, The Anatomy of Peace, the parents attend an initial seminar as their children embark on a wilderness therapy intervention. As they conclude the first day of parent education, two parents, the main two characters, reflect on their day. I'm a bad mom, the mother says. I think you're being too hard on yourself, Lou said. The truth, that's the father, the truth is Corey has been a terribly difficult boy. It's not your fault. It depends on what you mean by that, Lou, she said, regaining her composure. I understand that I may not be responsible for the things that he's done, but I am responsible for what I've done. A simple exchange of the difference between the two. Owning your stuff and still maintaining accountability. This next example is from my wife, having sent our son to a personalized wilderness therapy program in 2018. And this is this context. We sent my son on a wilderness and service adventure. Part of it was to get him outside and away from screen time, and part of it was to deal with some of the anxiety he was battling. In the course of his 30-day experience, we were asked to exchange letters at the direction of his counselor. In the first letter, we were asked to share our hopes and intentions for sending him on this trip. Here's a passage from my wife's letter where she eloquently and generously acknowledged her contribution to some of the issues. It's not lost on me, my wife wrote, the irony that we sent you on this trip to have you remove some of the walls, some of the defenses that you put in place to protect you from us and how we hurt you. Again, a wonderful ability to demonstrate accountability as a parent and empathy at the same time, and holding the child accountable. I love this quote, and this really, the Knight in Rusty Armor, which some of you are familiar with. My therapist, Jamie Gill, wrote a sequel to The Knight in Rusty Armor called The Letters of Juliette to the Knight in Rusty Armor. It's really the other side of the story, the wife who had made the ultimatum. And it's a series of 4 letters. And she says this in her own journey. She went on a similar journey to the Knight. She said, then I realized what has happened between us. I saw your armor was in the way, but I did not see that my expectations were in the way just the same. My anger at you when you wouldn't do what I wanted left you out as surely as your armor left me out. And I take you through a few passages along this kind of accountability for the wife. Early on in the book, she says, so after much thought, I've decided to try to find you. Maybe we can talk, she offers. I have to settle this once and for all. I don't know where you are, though I've been told you went back into the woods. I'm terribly afraid of those woods, as you know, but I want to find and see if you really are as impossible and close as I remember, or did I just invent it? A lot of parents will talk about that because they'll miss their child. And after the child is away for a while, the sting of the old dynamic loses its acuity, right? And we have a much more of a longing. As she goes through her own journey and working with her guide, or you consider her helper, Maurice. In the time since I met Maurice, she says, so much has changed. I scarcely know my name. I can't believe a viewpoint can change so much. She says to her husband, what would we be like without our armor, my knight? And at one point during her journey, she says, if you are home to receive this letter, my dear knight, I will be back soon. I hope you can accept me. If you are not home, I will save the letter to show you where I have been since you have been gone. My night, I am quieter. There's no overt demand for forgiveness. There's only mild hope. Well, there's a sincere hope, but there's no expectation that he must forgive her. All she's doing is saying, this is my part. This is what I've done. And that could be terrifying if we grew up in a house, and many of us did. I might even argue most of us did. If we grew up in a house where being right was the thing. So it's a shift. It's not an either or, it's a both and. My night, she says during her journey, I have done so poorly with my great love for you. Can you forgive me? I have done poorly with Christopher. That's their son. At this point, I imagine Marie's voice saying I had done poorly with me. This kind of accountability asks nothing of the other and needs nothing in return. The lettuce of Juliette is a perfect example of the sensibility present in true accountability. Somebody going on their own journey while the knight, or the child in this case, is away going through their forest, right? Their hero's adventure. The parent is at home looking at their stuff. Not to heap on shame and guilt and blame, not to paralyze you with guilt so that you can't hold a boundary, but rather to free yourself up and to be able to offer to your child the kind of strength that we're talking about today. I borrowed this from Harriet Lerner's book, Dr. Harriet Lerner's book, Why Won't You Apologize? Just some ways that we can mess up an apology. Even though the letter of accountability is not really an apology, it has aspects of an apology or aspects of an amends in it. Obviously, the word but in an apology can become a problem. I'm sorry that this, but you were out of control. I'm sorry that you feel that way. It's not really being accountable for your participation. It's being sorry for how they feel, which doesn't make any sense at all. If is an example that she says, I'm sorry if I was insensitive. Apologize for what you've done and not what you haven't. Take responsibility for how the other reacts. Just seeing your contribution. It's a really subtle distinction without owning their reaction. I can understand how triggering that might have been for you. I can understand how hurtful that might have been for you. But if you go too far and take responsibility for their reaction, their choices, you're kind of over apologizing. I talk about this all the time, that forgiveness, even from parent to child, forgiveness ideally comes on the terms and the time frame of the offended party, not the offender. So in a true amends letter or an apology or a letter of accountability from a parent, you don't ask for forgiveness. You allow for the time, the healing process that needs to occur for the other. She warns against an intrusive apology, which is to apologize for something that the other person is not ready to hear. It can be true in situations where there's been chronic behavior or maybe even abuse. Don't apologize to somebody who feels abused by you and doesn't want to hear from you. In that case, it becomes self-indulgent. Over apologizing loses its meaning. Maybe you suffer from that behavior. You know, my wife taught me this too, crying somebody else's tears. I remember when I was apologizing to her for something I'd done, and with this apology, this amends, there was a tremendous amount of shame. And I kind of looked down while I was feeling bad about myself. My wife picked up my chin, asked me to look at her, and said, I don't want to have to take care of you right now. And she was right. She was spot on. I was asking her to take care of my shame. It's not about you being forgiven. I've mentioned that. Underdoing an apology. You know, there's a piece of this making an amends that's kind of strange and ironic, and that is when you offer your accountability or your amends, sometimes the response is that the person that you're speaking to or writing to can get more angry. I see that a lot in the letter of awareness. When a child writes a letter of awareness, especially if there are novel instances where the child is acknowledging and confessing to, or if there are old patterns or behaviors that the parent suspected that the child is finally admitting to, the parent is likely to have a flare up of anger and betrayal. Or in the case of the letter of accountability, you write to your child, they can get more angry. I remember one specific time, although this has happened many, many times with my wife. I remember apologizing to her on one specific instance. And after I did, she went on kind of this response like, yeah, you were a jerk. And kind of piled on right then and there. And I remember saying to her, and I've said this many times in our marriage, I said, well, this isn't very reinforcing of my apology. But the fact of the matter is when we make an amends, when we apologize, we're opening up the gate for the person to be upset with us. We're giving them permission. And oftentimes opening that door will cause the flames of the anger and the hurt to be fanned, to get a little larger in the moment. And so one of the things that I think about is make sure you're ready for an apology. And if you're only ready for part of the process, maybe do some more work before you're ready to make an amends or make an apology or be accountable. And then the I'm sorry, are you sorry? It's not a quid pro quo, right? It's an apology, an accountability letter that you write is a gift. When I've had parents write an honest, courageous, clear, authentic accountability letter, their presentation, the way that they've responded is, my child can't use this against me because I don't need anything from them. I'm not explicitly or implicitly asking for something back. I'm merely giving this to them as a gift because I can. Because accountability and amends and an apology come from a place of strength and love and abundance. Dr. Lerner says in her book, Why Won't You Apologize? The worse the offense and the greater the shame, the more difficult it is for the wrongdoer to empathize with the harmed party and feel remorse. And I often think as parents, I think it's one of the reasons why an amends letter or a letter of accountability can be so difficult, because I said earlier that where the space you occupy in your child's psyche is a different place than they occupy in yours. And the fact of the matter is that for many of us, there's nothing more sacred to us, nothing that we're more sensitive about than our role as a father and a mother. And therefore, the idea that we dent our children, that we harm them, is overwhelming. Especially, again, if we grew up in a context where being right and being good was the thing. If being right and being good was the thing, this is going to be harder. If being a person was a thing, being flawed, being imperfect, being fallible was more modeled for us, more okay, this will be a little bit easier. When our identity, she says, and sense of worth are at risk of being diminished or annihilated, we will not be able to offer a true apology and face all that the challenge of earning back trust entails. We are more likely to wrap ourselves in a blanket of rationalization, minimization, and denial in order to survive. Defensiveness is no longer merely a roadblock that we can observe and get past after we calm down and limber up the thinking part of our brain. When we have lost sight of our value and worth, defensiveness is where we live. It becomes a matter of survival. And then finally, most people who commit serious harm never get to the point where they can admit their harmful actions, much less apologize and aim to repair them. Their shame leads to denial and self-deception that overrides their ability to orient towards reality. No person can be more honest with us than they can be with their own self. I work with obviously parents quite a bit, and I've noticed over the years that this can be a very, very difficult part of the process. It's very common for parents to say, it's not my problem. This is not my issue. I'm not the one with the symptoms. And overtly, clearly, they're right about that. But with some digging and some awareness, we realize how imperfect we are. And when we're, in my experience, when we have a relationship with a healer, with a therapist who can see us and model compassion for our imperfect, like my therapist calls it, a horrible, rotten self, when they can show compassion for that version of us, then we can unburden ourselves from the pressure of getting it right. I say this all the time, that if new parents came to me and say, what one piece of advice would you give me having my first child? And new parents never ask me that. Even friends and associates who know what I do for a living and know what my focus and emphasis is, nobody ever asks me that if it's a new parent. But if they were to, I would say to them, you can't get it right. You're going to fail at this. You're going to make mistakes. And that is not to shed a dark light on the topic of parenting, but just to really free you and your child up from the idea that you can win this game. And when you give up the idea of winning and getting it right, then your child's just allowed to be angry at you. And you're allowed to have boundaries and accountability when they are angry. Both can coexist. But if you have to get it right, your children are going to find a very difficult path in being angry and hurt and upset with you, because you're going to have reasons why they ought not to be. So esteem and healing and growth and parenting progress is really all about coming in contact with our own humanity, accepting and learning to love our horrible, rotten self. Mostly this is about ownership, owning your piece of it. And the struggle that you have with it will tell you and us and others something about the power dynamic in your family of creation, the children and the family that you have now. And it will tell us something about the family that you grew up in. Because power and intimacy are essentially mutually exclusive in relationship. When there's a power indifference, intimacy suffers. And so if power becomes the paradigm, intimacy will suffer greatly, because intimacy requires vulnerability, letting down your guard, being wrong and human, but being you. I want to be clear about that. Sometimes I don't state that emphatically enough. You get to be you. You get to say when you've had enough, when enough is enough. And really, in this work, in the letter of accountability, you're modeling for your child. Right? Don't we all want our children to be able to look at their fallibility, their imperfections, their mistakes, and to own them? Writing a letter of accountability is great. So we ask you to do it. You don't have to do it. We invite you to do it. We would help to coach you around it in the same ways that we coach your child when they write the letter of awareness. We'll coach you around the letter of accountability, give you our thoughts and our feedback, tweak it a little bit if need be. Like I said, sometimes maybe you just want to share that with your home therapist, with your personal therapist. If you feel more courageous, you can share it with your child's therapist at Evoke, or if you feel really grounded, you can share it with your child. And then the same way that we ask your child to let go of the outcome of their letter of awareness to you, you are invited in that process to let go of the outcome. In other words, let go of how they react to it. And ultimately, you're abandoning right. Like I talk about in the Audacity to be you, you're learning to be a person. In this work, you don't get to be right, anymore. You get to be a self, and being a self is so much better. Happy to take any live questions. Somebody wrote, I don't see any of my child's letters yet accepting any responsibility or admittance of their behaviors with or without why. So far, all 5 weeks of letters have just been angry and resentful for being sent. We just keep responding with our boundaries, and this is what we're trying to do. No explanations or justifications. How do we respond? You know, one thought I have about that is maybe get curious. Maybe get curious about why they're not accountable. Maybe talk to your Evoke therapist or them. You know, when a child is unable or unwilling to make progress therapeutically, there's a reason. Not good or bad, justifiable or not, but there's a reason. And so get curious about why your child is unable to be accountable. And then start modeling for them, like I suggested, start modeling for them accountability. And again, when I was younger, I want to be clear about this. When I was younger, I did not want parents to model accountability before the child did, because I came from and lived in paradigms of power and control. Now, I think surrendering control is the best way to encourage somebody to let down their armor, to take down their walls. So I would encourage you to model accountability. And then when they attack you, see, true accountability doesn't need to defend against an attack because you're not trying to be right or better. So I would say get curious, ask questions of your child and the therapist. Empathic curiosity about why the child doesn't feel safe. And then modeling your own accountability. Somebody says, what do you do when nothing you do is right or works? Well, that's the perfect place to be, isn't it? Because none of this works. A lot of accountability doesn't work. Working is kind of holding on to outcomes. Really. I had a father one time come to me in a parent meeting, and he was just exasperated because he was trying to hear his daughter, his adult daughter, and her frustration and her anger and her resentment toward him. And he came to the meeting prepared to tell me the story where he tried to listen and reflect and understand and show empathy. And he said, after describing the interaction, he said, see, Brad, it doesn't work. And I said, what do you mean work? And he said, she's still angry and resentful. And I said, I think that's where it is. I think she can sense that you're trying to get her to change. When those behaviors, like the letter of accountability, is just, there's no outcome. It's love is a giving thing. It doesn't ask for in return. Read or listen to the podcasts on the Knight in Rusty Armor and the Letters of Juliette, because it's a fantastic model for, we don't ask for something back. We don't apologize or model accountability so that we can say then, see, I did it, now you do it. I'm sorry, now are you sorry? We do it because it's a better way to live. We do it to get out of the dance where we're contributing to the problem. But we have to really separate ourselves out from this cause and effect thinking that really does support the child's accusation of us that we're trying to control them. Somebody asked the question, how do you handle the numbness and shock that make it very difficult to access your own emotional clarity and intelligence in order to source the truth you would want to share for healing in the letters? My daughter is home now, but I remember that time, and it was really scary and difficult and almost bigger than I could comprehend early on. Well, that's a very powerful question. And I guess my answer would be, it's a life's work. It's a life's work. It's the rest of your life. It's painful, and we're overwhelmed, and we're not going to get it right, and we're going to fail, and we're going to stumble, and we're going to dent them. And you're going to be overwhelmed and unable to do all of this that I'm I stumble through this stuff all the time. And if our children are waiting for and relying on us to get it right, they're doomed. It's nice when we can kind of figure it out, but they're doomed if it's about us getting it right or being perfect. What they need from us is for us to be clear that we are the project, not them. We unburden them when we make primarily ourselves and our growth the project. That's what they need from us. They're tired of being the project. They don't too much like being the identified patient. Accountability is hard for anybody, but when they're the reason for the families or the parents' unhappiness, it's too great of a burden for them to bear. So we make our peace, our serenity, our growth, our meaning in our life, our project. And we unburden them from carrying that load. Someone says, my partner and I are sitting together on the beach next to a fire 7 years after writing these letters to each other. We report that we are doing well and thank you for your bravery and showing up. It is not for nothing. I'm glad. I know some of you that are in attendance tonight have written incredible, courageous amends letters and letters of accountability to your children. Someone, maybe this is a follow-up. Someone said, it's all good now, but I mean, in support from Evoke to a newly traumatized parent who is faced with all the things we need to do in the early days of our child being there. I think this is back to the question, how do you handle the numbness and shock? You take it at what stages you can. You just do what you can when you can. There's no, you can only do what you can do. And if you're not ready, there's no moral imperative to be ready. You have to do the work. See, everything that you do that may harm your child, or everything that you don't do or not able to do that would harm your child, the idea in psychotherapy through the mental health lens is it comes from a wound in you, ignorance at best, and a wound on the more severe end of the continuum of reasons. And so you need to heal. And that's why you deserve as much compassion as your child does. That's why phrases like helicopter parenting or snowplow parenting, that's why I have no stomach for them. Because they're just glib ways of describing symptoms that come from a parent's narcissistic wound from their own childhood. Why do we beat up parents? We don't do it to children. We try not to. Why would we beat up a parent for coming to this work with a wound that needs healing? That doesn't make any sense. What does a parent do in the middle of confrontation manipulation with your child when all of our knowledge goes out the window? Yeah, that's a good question. Timeout. You take a timeout. You walk away. You kind of resort to skill-based responses and you take a timeout. And that's going to happen to all of us. And you learn to forgive yourself. Forgive yourself for not being perfect yet. All right. Upcoming events, announcements. Our intensives are also online now, so if you want to attend an intensive, we have more opportunities online. We also have some live in-person ones with extra testing. Everybody involved gets COVID tested before them, and then we take special precautions in our location. So you can do that. You can also attend them online. Contact intensives@evoketherapy.com for more information or to register. We're doing a Pursuits Adventure trip this summer. We have one scheduled for August 16th through 23rd in the high Uintas. That's the mountain range here close to the northern Utah land. So this is a 7-day adolescent therapy light trip. So maybe a sibling would be a good good person or a student who's graduated who wants to come back and experience some wilderness light. For more information, contact Sarah at evoketherapy.com, Sarah without an H. We also have custom Pursuits Adventure trips anywhere from 3 to 30 days. We have upcoming parent support groups for Wilderness Therapy alumni. So July 16th, Mikey Mean will be conducting one at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And tomorrow evening, July 14th, Travis Slagle, our new clinical director of our intensives program, will be conducting one 6 p.m. Mountain Time tomorrow evening. Contact Malia at evoketherapy.com for more information on all of our support groups. We ask all of you to go to 6 12-step support groups, any combination of any of the options. All of these broadcasts are available on your podcast app. One thing I wanted to say about this, going back to the intensives, one of the things I just want to comment on is that because I'm doing these broadcasts and I'm the founder of the company, and I think a lot of times people assume it's coming to see me. Our staff are amazing. And I can't tell you how many times I've had participants come and participate with our intensive staff, with Travis and Emma and the others, and have said, I came here, I wanted to be with Brad because I knew Brad, but I'm really glad I got you. So the model, the training that we do, the approach is consistent. It is the Evoke way, based on attachment theory, experiential work, compassion. It's based on what we do. So don't wait for me to be doing one. The staff, I trust them with my closest friends and family members, and some of them are my family members. So just wanted to make that plug. All of these are available on your favorite podcast app. You can find us on Twitter and Instagram using the Evoke Therapy handle, or the intensives program is, you can use the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. On Facebook, you can find both Evoke Therapy programs, and now Evoke Therapy Intensives is also on Facebook. The Evoke Family Foundation is an organization that helps people that can't afford therapy. So if you want to contribute or join that organization, you can find them on Facebook or their website. Also go to our blog. My two books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are available on Amazon. I'm just about ready to release the audio version of the book. I just got back the main chapters that I did. I'm having somebody else do. I'm trying to get my therapist who wrote the foreword to do the audio for that. So we're trying to get that set up. Someone said, I've been to intensives with Brad and without Brad, and both were incredible. Thank you. We're going to be doing a Q&A this Wednesday. This is one where you can come. You can invite family and friends and siblings. So this Wednesday, July 15th at 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time, 6:30 p.m. Mountain Time this Wednesday. I'll be hosting a Q&A. Send in questions in advance. Feel free to share with extended family and siblings. Feel free to come and ask questions for them. This is on any topic that you want to. So I'll be doing that this Wednesday. Thank you for joining me. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. I really want to commend you for being willing to look at and do your own work, as all of you do at Evoke, and for showing up for something like this. And I hope that those of you listening through the podcast app also get something out of it. Take care, folks. Have a great night. Talk to you later. Bye-bye.